So hi everyone, Dr. Nayo here. I'm one of Rupa's physicians who does functional medicine videos to try to help support our whole population in being healthier. So I'm a certified functional medicine doctor. I've been practicing for almost 20 years now and really enjoy just getting information out to folks so that we all can improve and optimize our health. So today we're going to be speaking about how is my gut inflaming my heart? And I know these two don't seem like they would necessarily be a pair that you would put together, but they're very relevant. And I want to just explore that with you today so we can make some headway in supporting optimal heart health. Generally, when I'm talking to my clients one-on-one, I'm oftentimes speaking of 5 modifiable risk factors. I put 6 here today because all 6 are relevant, but the 6 that I want to explore with you today are stress, inflammation, insulin resistance, lipid burden, toxicity, and clotting. I also put to the side because I don't want people to think that when I'm speaking about those 6 modifiable root causes, that we're leaving out some very important things that have to be addressed, including lifestyle, which could be how we think, how we exercise, how we eat, our body composition. Do we have a lot of lean body mass? Do we have a lot of unnecessary inflammatory excess fat that may be very pro-inflammatory? What's our blood pressure? Because that's really important for cardiovascular disease. And then are we a smoker or not? So these are definitely for sure important. So I'm not forgetting about those. But these are root causes that I think about talking to my clients about as we're preventing cardiovascular disease. So the first one that I put up here, you can see I have sort of a feed forward cycle because these 6 factors feed on themselves. They're not just independent root causes. They actually work together and can propagate more and more cardiovascular risks as you stack each factor on top of the other. So I put stress at the top, and I say this to my clients all the time. 95% of all disease and disorders that I see, stress can account for, at least in part, some of that disorder or disease that I'm seeing. So it is the most important thing for us to address. Now, stress can be psychological stress. So what am I thinking about? Am I spending more time in fear and worry, doubt, or am I spending time knowing that everything's working, I'm supported, health is, something that is flowing through me? That is a form of stress and probably the most important to address first. But there's also internal stress. So if our system is not healthy, that registers as a form of stress too, and we need to address both. So stress is the most important because I find that it really does impact other systems throughout our bodies. Next, we have inflammation. So stress definitely feeds forward and can definitely support a heavier inflammatory burden on our systems. So addressing stress making sure that we're talking to and addressing inflammation is very important. And we'll get into that in a lot of detail. I often find inflammation and insulin resistance can go hand in hand, so one can affect the other. So insulin resistance is a very important factor that we need to address. Lipid burden. Lipid burden is important because it's not just how high is my LDL, my HDL. This is what type of cholesterol do I have? And I'm speaking of something called lipoproteins, apolipoproteins. Do I have a more inflammatory, what we call atherogenic pattern of particles that is showing up in my lab specimen? Very important to know what's going on because how that profile lays out can be very informative as to my cardiovascular risk. So that's important. And then we look at toxicity. Now we know we're living more and more and increasingly in a very toxic world. So that's psychologically toxic, also physically from a lot of the xenoestrogens, toxins, heavy metals, persistent organic pollutants that are coming in contact with our system. It's very important that we're looking at, are we supporting our detox pathways and are we limiting our exposure to these things? And then lastly, we're going to talk about clotting. Not as much today because I couldn't find as much that was relevant in terms of how the gut would be affecting that, but it's definitely an important factor to be thinking about when we're reducing cardiovascular risk. Now you'll notice I put in the center of this feed forward cycle, the standard American diet. A lot of functional medicine doctors will refer to this as the SAD diet. This is very important important because this underpins a lot of these factors. So if we can address the standard American diet, a lot of times some of these things are just going to get better. And if I could do only two things with people would be to address stress instead the standard American diet, change it to more whole food, plant-based heavy diet, rich in phytonutrients, because those two factors are really pivotal in switching and shifting somebody's health picture. All right, so let's talk about key antecedents and imbalances that must be assessed in order to optimize gut health. Now, when a functional medicine doctor is speaking about an antecedent, that means we're looking at things that predated the issue or disorder or disease that is showing up that played into that, supporting that imbalance or disease. So that's what an antecedent is. So when we think about optimal gut health or the lack thereof, we want to be looking at what was the mother's health status before she even got pregnant. For instance, a mother's microbiome and the health of that preconception is very important because it's going to inform the development of that developing embryo, its microbiome, as well as its digestive system. We also want to look at what was happening in utero. So in terms of the mother's health, her microbiome, we also want to be aware if there was a lot of stress in the pregnancy or a lot of different medications. All of this, again, can inform the health of the microbiome and digestive health of the developing fetus. We want to be aware of the client in front of us, or if it's you personally, whether there was an issue in terms of delivery. Did the patient or yourself have to be delivered by a C-section? This is really important because coming through the vagina, but through the vaginal birth canal, is very important to pick up a lot of important flora that help the immune system to develop and inform the immune system of what's supposed to be supportive of health. So that's a very important step that a lot of times is being missed these days because C-sections are often offered to mothers relatively easily. So that's important. We also want to think about what was that person's childhood health. So did they have a poor diet, was not nutrient dense, a lot of plant-rich foods, devoid of a lot of sugar, processed food, etc. All of that informs the microbiome and can determine whether you have a lot of healthy bugs in that microbiome, which are accounting for and informing the nervous system of that individual. We want to know if a person's had a lot of antibiotics. So the antibiotics are going to kill a lot of favorable microbes that are growing in the gut, which are very important for immune health. Other medications also could be wiping out the healthy organisms that are growing in the gut. We want to know, was there a lot of stress or trauma? That has huge impact on gut health, the immune system, the microbiome. So very important to be aware of as well. As an adult, we want to know some of the same things. Was there a lack of diversity in the diet, especially lacking a lot of phytonutrients, whole foods, fiber? We want to know, was there a lot of medication use? For instance, NSAIDs like ibuprofen, naproxen, things like that. Antibiotics, proton pump inhibitors, those are your things like pantoprazole that someone would use for acid reflux, birth control pills. These are all things that really impede or interfere with the lining of the gut, which I'll speak to in a minute, which can support a lot of inflammation and ultimately sometimes allergies. So that's very important to be aware of. We want to know if somebody has a lot of food allergies, food sensitivities, because this can be an ongoing source of inflammation, which ultimately can inflame other aspects of the body. And then the last thing that I put here is that we want to be aware of somebody's toxic load. If somebody has had such a heavy toxic burden, whether it's through their diet, products they're using, things that are in the water supply, just things that are in the environment in general, that can be a heavy burden for the whole system, including the digestive tract, liver, kidneys, to actually deal with. And that actually can impact cardiovascular health as well. So let's start with the first modifiable root cause of cardiovascular disease, which is stress. So stress supports increased intestinal permeability. So let's start here. The gut has a barrier that is made up of, on a cellular level, that has little gap junctions in between the cells. Appropriate food particles, which are appropriately digested, get through and get absorbed and are utilized appropriately. However, if these gap junctions through stress, medications, trauma, different things happen, if they open too much, these gap junctions become too wide, you get something called increased intestinal permeability, or what a lot of lay people call leaky gut. And that means things get through that ordinarily would not, and they mount an immune response, which is appropriate. However, if you keep having this ongoing immune response that's necessary because you have things getting through inappropriately that your immune system has to address, that creates a problem for your system and it becomes overwhelming for your immune system. This does a few things. It supports systemic inflammation. Sometimes that can lead to food allergies and sensitivities because you start to get exposure to things that create an immune response as a result of too many things getting through and too many large particles getting through. You also get an imbalance of what's growing in the gut, which is called dysbiosis. You also get a weakened and dysregulated immune response if this goes on for a long time. So if the repair of these gap junctions, the gut mucosa does not take place and the immune system keeps having to respond, that can lead to a chronic immune response, which becomes weakened over time. And this ultimately, I call like a fire in the belly, is not contained over time. And that fire in the belly or inflammation does not stay there. And one of the places that it can go is the heart. And so potentially with a weakened, persistent, dysregulated immune response, that fire is not contained in the belly and put out, and then it can start inflaming the heart as well, which can support cardiovascular disease risk. So that's very important to understand. The other thing to be aware of is that when the intestinal barrier, which is meant really to be your line of defense to make sure that inappropriate substances, toxins, organisms, pathogens are not getting into your system because your immune system is here ready to respond if they are. When that goes on over time, there's a dysregulation of that response. And sometimes we start to see poor absorption of key minerals and nutrients, and that directly could be impacting cardiovascular health as well. Additionally, we also see when people are stressed, they're less likely to have the healthy microbes that are going to be supported and sustained over time. And these really healthy organisms are very important to have an appropriate immune response, which also supports healthy cardiometabolic health. And when I speak of cardiometabolic health, that means the cardiovascular system and then the endocrine or hormonal system that is supporting insulin and blood sugar regulation. And this becomes very important because if you lose those healthy bugs and you just have too many bad guys thriving in the gut, the immune system becomes dysregulated and is not optimal. So you get a weakened immune response. And we'll get to in a minute, the insulin resistance response also becomes threatened as well. Next, stress also can create something called dysbiosis, which I mentioned before. Dysbiosis is just a term we use in the functional medicine world, which just means that there's a dysfunctional balance in what is going on in the microbiome. And that's not specific in saying what's happening, but there's an imbalance between the good guys and possibly bad guys or pathogens. What this means is it can support infections because you don't have the appropriate bugs to support an optimal immune response. You could also get actual infections because of that. We also know that stress can weaken your ability to digest properly, which ultimately, again, leads to poor nutrient absorption, which is key for cardiovascular health. There's some key nutrients your heart requires. We also know that as the microbes change, certain organisms can favor insulin resistance. And that's generally if you're having less healthy bugs or microbes in the digestive tract, that can support insulin resistance, which is a direct risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And we'll speak to that in just a minute. All right. So I wanted to speak to the fact, again, why stress is so important. It impacts at least 4 of those other modifiable risk factors. So it propagates inflammation, it propagates insulin resistance, the lipid burden, and what I mean by that, what type of lipoproteins and apolipoprotein particles are present in your cardiovascular system that could be supporting cardiovascular risk. It also plays a role in supporting the toxic burden, meaning your system is not as capable in a stressed state of being able to freely dispose of toxins the way that we would hope. So I'm going to talk about inflammation in terms of gut health first with diet. So a poor diet inflames the gut. We're going to start with the SAD diets. Remember, I mentioned this in the beginning, the standard American diet. This tends to be a very hyperglycemic, high-fat diet. And what that means is that the load of processed foods, processed inflammatory fats is so heavy on the system that it creates a high blood sugar response, so hypoglycemic. And the high fats, which are usually unhealthy inflammatory fats like trans fats, that creates and signals danger to the gut. This may be important because it can increase dangerous bacteria that have a lining on the outside of the cell, the membrane, the outer membrane called lipopolysaccharide. You'll hear this referred to as LPS. And that's important because it's particularly gram-negative bacteria that have this. And if this danger response is allowed to keep going, you keep getting this increase in these bacteria that have lipopolysaccharide or LPS, it can cause something called metabolic endotoxemia. And so what this is it's a hyperregulated, like an overdrive immune response that is there to address inflammation. And this is problematic, not just because it's driving inflammation forward, which is a cardiovascular risk in and of itself, but it's also throwing into the pot, creating insulin resistance, which we'll talk about moving forward. Another thing that this type of diet, the standard American diet, can do is it creates an unhealthy microbiome with less favorable microbes. This is important because remember I said when you got a lot of those bad bugs, you're going to support a more unhealthy, dysregulated immune response, and you're also going to support insulin resistance. We also know that the standard American diet is associated with that belly fat, that central weight gain. That fat is very problematic because it's very inflammatory, in particular to your visceral organs. So your vital organs, your heart is one of those. And so when you get that fire in the belly, that inflammatory belly fat, that's another source of inflammation, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. This diet ultimately is one that also can bridge and breach that gut barrier, which remember is supposed to be your friend. It's supposed to just have a very small gap, which only appropriate nutrients should be getting through. And that type of diet in particular is very supportive of the breakdown of that barrier. And that creates leaky gut, which ultimately can lead to an inappropriate inflammatory response. So just to kind of summarize a few of the things that I want you to leave this with is that standard American diet can be a self-perpetuating cycle of inflammation in the gut microbiome. And I should stop here because I don't want to take for granted why I'm speaking so much about the gut and the microbiome. So the reason that the microbiome and the gut you'll often hear me and others speak about them hand in hand is because 70 to 80% of your immune system's in your gut. And that has a lot to do with a lot of microorganisms growing in your gut. And so because such a large part of our immune system resides in the gut, when the gut becomes disturbed, that barrier, how we digest, how we absorb, the inflammatory response to foods, when all of these things become dysregulated and that microbiome changes to an unhealthy pattern, it's a big deal because it's changing your immune system because 70, 80% of your immune system is there. And so the more that you can preserve the health of the gut and therefore the health of the microbiome and therefore the health of the immune system, you're actually helping your whole system. You're helping your heart, you're helping your brain, you're helping your joints, you're helping your nervous system, your skin. There's so many things that are an extension of a healthy gut microbiome and immune system. So that's why we really want to take the time to be thoughtful about how are we either not supporting or hopefully supporting this system. So if you are eating the standard American diet on a regular basis and perpetuating the cycle of inflammation, you're further exacerbating insulin resistance potentially. You have a higher toxic load for sure that individual has to deal with. You have a weakened microbiome, which indirectly is going to or directly impair your immune response. You may have mitochondrial dysfunction. And so your mitochondria are really important for generating energy in your cells. So not just energy in terms of how you feel, it is for sure that, but it's also how your body is able to generate energy to actually function and run all the systems in the body. So when the mitochondria become dysfunctional, it's a big deal for your whole body. And then the last one I put down here is that more dangerous visceral belly fat that can become very inflammatory for your heart and other systems. So now let's talk about how does gut inflammation inflame the heart a little bit in more detail for the heart specifically. So as inflammation increases in the gut and you've got this upregulated hyperimmune response, so this huge fire surging in the belly, that actually can translate and make its way into inflammation in the heart. As we have more unhealthy organism or microbes in the gut, that also supports insulin resistance, which we know is a part of metabolic disease, which also supports inflammation in the heart and creates what we call dyslipidemia. Again, an imbalance of the healthy lipoproteins, cholesterol particles that support atherogenic, which means some of the things that are required to develop atherosclerosis in the heart, which is what causes cardiovascular disease. So we want to be really on top of unhealthy microbes in the gut that might be supporting either insulin resistance, leading to metabolic disease, which is generally made up of insulin resistance, inflammation, impact on liver, and imbalance in the cholesterol molecules. So those are some things that you can see happen. And all of this inflammation and imbalance in the cardiovascular system and insulin resistance can support cardiovascular risk. When we have a more inflamed gut, that means likely that we may have a higher toxic burden. And that's important because with the unhealthy microbiome, we're further going to be supporting the cardiovascular system to move into oxidative stress or to experience more oxidative stress in that system. And what that means is that the microbiome is not necessarily supporting having less oxidative stress, which I describe to my clients is like chronic inflammation that's not being handled and neutralized over time. And it creates what we call free radicals, which I'll liken to rust in the body, which supports breakdown of the system. So we don't want that. And that really does come with a higher toxic burden and imbalance in the microbiome. The next thing that we want to be thinking about when gut inflammation increases is that the unhealthy gut microbiome can cause that central obesity, which I've mentioned so many times before, which is also a source of inflammation. The impaired intestinal permeability, which a lot of people will refer to as leaky gut, that's that breach barrier that I've talked about a few times now. That supports inflammation. It supports food allergies, food sensitivities, and possibly autoimmune diseases, all of which could be affecting cardiovascular health. So I just wanted to summarize a few of the things. This is in no way exhaustive of all the ways that gut inflammation can support cardiometabolic risk, but I wanted to put a few things out here for us to consider. As we let that gut inflammation keep going and perpetuate itself, it creates an upregulated or even dysregulated immune response. So remember, that weakens your immune system. Your immune system is dealing with trying to put out a fire rather than appropriately mount an immune response to the occasional immune threat. So this becomes a problem when we're always trying to address putting out the fire rather than keeping balance or homeostasis in the body. The next thing to remember and leave with is that we don't want that central obesity or fire in the belly that comes with the gut inflammation. So the more that we eat that standard American diet, don't move, that supports that inflammatory fat from gaining in the midsection around your vital organs, one of those being the heart. The next thing to remember is that as we eat that standard American diet and are weakening the lining of the gut, we're increasing lipopolysaccharide from those more dangerous bacteria, and that causes metabolic endotoxemia, which is an inappropriate immune response if it's an ongoing thing. And it also supports imbalance in the metabolic system, which ultimately can support insulin resistance. Then getting back to insulin resistance, the more that you eat the standard American diet and not supporting an optimal microbiome, that's going to support insulin resistance because it interferes with the insulin sensitivity pathways. So insulin is a hormone which is released from your pancreas, and it's meant to appropriately deal with the appropriate amount of glucose that comes in to your system through a whole foods diet, meaning it's not supposed to have to deal with a deluge of glucose coming from a large soda and French fries and a cheeseburger on a buttered toasted bun. It's not meant to have to deal with that much glucose. And when that happens over time, the insulin signaling pathways become disturbed and that insulin response is going to become dysregulated. Why do we care about that from the heart perspective? The more insulin resistant you are, you eat that, whatever is broken down to glucose. So let's just say you drink that soda, that's a lot of glucose. Your system has insulin in the bloodstream, but the insulin's sitting here and can't handle or do anything. It doesn't even recognize to do anything with the glucose. That's problematic because that glucose sits there and it's very pro-inflammatory for your system. And then after a while, that's going to lead to an elevated blood sugar, which becomes a feed-forward cycle again, supporting this cardiovascular risk. The other thing to leave with is the increased intestinal permeability is problematic because it's a setup for food allergies, food sensitivities, and again, that hyper or upregulated immune response where your immune system's dealing with putting out a fire instead of keeping balance in your system. And then the final point that I want to leave you with gut inflammation and heart health is the higher the inflammatory burden, so constantly trying to put out fires in the gut, you may develop more and more food sensitivities as that happens and allergies, which we've actually seen where you can take people off of things like gluten, grains, dairy, things like that, and we can actually see that help with cardiovascular markers. And that's because the inflammation that's coming from those foods actually can start to inflame the heart itself. So it's very important to look at all these different ways that through your nutrition and gut health, you can actually optimize and support optimal heart and gut health. So now let's get into our next root cause that we can address, and that's insulin resistance. And you're going to hear a lot of things repeated in terms of what is affecting each one of these modifiable factors. And that's why I have the standard American diet at the center, because you're going to hear that a lot of the same things are causing disruption. So gut imbalances and insulin resistance. This is, again, by no means exhaustive in the different ways that the gut can become imbalanced and support insulin resistance. But I have three key ones I wanted to leave everybody with. I also didn't want to leave out that standard American diet that I've been talking so much about, the SAD diet. The more that we eat that SAD diet, that in of itself, as I just mentioned, creates a higher glycemic load on the system, which requires a higher response from insulin to actually deal with all this huge load of glucose that's being dumped into the system. And over time, the body cannot. It gets overwhelmed. So the insulin just sits here, it stops responding, and we have something called insulin resistance. And then eventually, because the insulin's not addressing and taking care of this glucose, the blood sugar goes up and up. And we know that that's very pro-inflammatory, supports metabolic imbalances, impacts liver health, impacts cardiovascular health. So that's an important thing that I didn't put on here, but I wanted to make sure that that was very much in the forefront of our thinking. Now, specifically, what I did put down here is you see that LPS that I spoke about before with those gram-negative bacteria that often are going to come from a SAD, standard American diet, they create an endotoxin, which the LPS, there's an endotoxin, and that directly has been found to be a causative factor in insulin resistance. We also know that when you lose the diversity of healthy organisms, that's problematic. So whenever you do a functional stool analysis with your functional medicine doctor, we can look at all the organisms that are growing out of your specimen, and we want to see lots of them, but mostly healthy groups of organisms we want to see growing. And if you only had one of the groups, that's not necessarily, optimal either. We want to have a diversity of the different organisms because it's the diversity of the organisms that support and underpin a healthy immune system. So this is really important. So with a standard American diet, with stress, a leaky gut, all these different things you've heard me speak about today, when you lose the diversity of those healthy organisms, that's weakening your immune system. It's also supporting insulin resistance. And in particular, we know that we want lots of short chain fatty acid producing bacteria. So that's what the SCFA means. These are very important to, one, heal the gut lining, so the leaky gut. These organisms particularly are helpful for that, but they're very important for supporting your immune system. Akkermansia is an emerging organism people have been talking about for the last several years, which has been found to be really important for optimal insulin and blood sugar regulation. When we see a stool specimen of a patient with metabolic disease, a lot of times we won't see a lot of Akkermansia growing. So this is an important one to support the diversity or the growth of. And then bifidobacterium is another important group of organisms that we want to have thriving in the gut as well, very supportive of the immune system and the insulin blood sugar response. So that's very important to maintain the diversity of healthy organisms to support blood sugar and insulin regulation. Then we have obese. This is a small study that I found that they looked at obese individuals, and then they found that they may have had the group that they looked at have a lower level of Bacteroides and a higher level of Firmicutes. And this is important. This is another thing that functional medicine doctors look at on a functional stool analysis, is looking at the distribution of certain organisms in particular that may support insulin resistance. And this is a pattern that has been elucidated. All right, let's get on to the next modifiable risk factor for cardiovascular disease, lipid burden. So when I think of gut health and lipid burden, there are so many different ways we could go with this. And because this is not specifically a cholesterol or lipid talk, we're going to talk about just a few categories. So the first one, again, you're hearing the repetition come in. So we have the lack of gut microbiome diversity, meaning you don't have a lot of those healthy bugs and different types of them. And this is important because your bile acids are responsible and play a part in your cholesterol metabolism and elimination. What they found is that when you have a lack of diversity in the microbiome, that can alter the bile acids, and you can start to synthesize more bile acids, which can decrease the breakdown or catabolism of cholesterol, and as well as decrease the excretion of cholesterol, meaning you hold on to more cholesterol in the system. And that's problematic, as you know, because the higher cholesterol levels are linked with cardiovascular risk. And I would go even a step further. It's not just the high cholesterol, it's the pattern of that dyslipidemia, so that the inappropriate cholesterol lipoproteins that are allowed to develop as a result of poor microbiome diversity, diet, etc., that's problematic, which is oftentimes seen with higher cholesterol levels. But it's not just high cholesterol alone that is the issue. Then we have dysbiosis. Remember I said this is when you have an imbalance of the good guys and the bad guys. Too many of the pathogenic or potentially pathogenic organisms are allowed to thrive versus having more of your healthy groups of organisms to support the immune system, the barrier that is in the gut, to be your first line of defense down there. And so I found this small study looking at men with atherosclerosis and then men who did not have cardiovascular disease. And what they found is that the men with the higher levels of cholesterol had higher levels of a group of organisms called Prevotella and lower levels of Clostridium. And so again, it's that imbalance of certain potentially protective organism that plays a role in your body being able to have that dyslipidemic, that inappropriate lipoprotein profile that supports cardiovascular risk, meaning the development of atherosclerosis in the cardiovascular system. The next, this may or may not be one you've heard of, TMAO. So this is an emerging marker that a lot of people are looking at. It's not as simple as, do you have a high level of this? This needs to be interpreted in the context of your whole health picture. But just to share what it's about, it's a metabolite that's produced by gut bacteria. What has been found is that red meat, full-fat dairy, eggs, yogurt, energy drinks, and certain supplements may contain key nutrients that bacteria can break down and release a metabolite called TMA into the blood. This can then, the TMA can then be delivered to the liver and ultimately converted into TMAO. Why this is important is that if TMAO is elevated, you may have a 2.5 increased risk for cardiovascular disease. But as I said, this needs to be interpreted in the context of the full health picture. So we're not using this alone to confer whether this is a risk factor or not. The supplements, just to kind of mention, or the nutrients that are relevant for this are carnitine, choline, and phosphatidylcholine. And some of these are very important nutrients, which is why I don't want to unilaterally, have people just come off of these without having this interpreted in the context of their full health picture with their functional medicine doctor. But that is one that you'll hear people speaking more about. Then we have SFAs, which are short chain fatty acids. Remember, I spoke about these before. These small short chain fatty acids are the fuel for anaerobic bacteria in particular, and they're very important for the health of your immune system, that intestinal barrier that I've spoken about several times. And you can get the short chain fatty acids from a high fiber rich diet. And so what we've seen is that when people are eating a low fiber processed diet, the microbiome is often going to lack the short chain fatty acids that are meant to support healthy probiotic growth. And these organisms that utilize short chain fatty acids in particular help to decrease inflammation, repair cardiac tissue, and influence cholesterol metabolism. And so that's specific for cardiovascular risk. So all 4 of these are things to be considering interpreting with your functional medicine doctor. So now let's move on to toxicity. So toxicity is a big one because we spoke a lot about toxic burden. So this may have been one that you've already spoken with your functional medicine doctor about. So homocysteine is an amino acid that makes proteins. And this is a surrogate marker a lot of times that doctors will look at to look at B vitamin status. And in particular, B12, B6, and folic acid degrade homocysteine, and those vitamins actually convert it into something that your body can actually utilize. So when do we see homocysteine get out of balance? It's mostly, this is how we tie it to the gut. So nutrition is going to be coming from people eating a lot of meat, having a poor diet, excess alcohol intake, coffee intake, some medications, insulin resistance, or diabetes. So these are all things that in some way we've already been speaking about. Why do we care about homocysteine? Well, excess or elevated homocysteine levels is actually an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And what that means is independent of anything else that's going on in the cardiovascular system, what we can look at on labs, etc. When your homocysteine is high, that's a risk factor. Specifically, homocysteine actually can line and damage the lining of our arteries and also support clot formation and block the blood flow in the vessels. And that's very important because that is part of the process of developing atherosclerosis in the arteries that leads to cardiovascular disease. One of my favorite things to look at, because it's a very easy thing for clients to address, I like to see optimal homocysteine levels less than 10. Like I said, super easy to address. You just have to make sure patients or you yourself are getting in enough B12, folic acid, or B6, either from diet or supplementation. So it's a very nice one because it's very easy to be able to optimize, and you see this marker go down quickly, which is a risk factor, as I stated. Then I wanted to mention a little bit of environmental toxins and their impact on cardiovascular risk. Heavy metals may increase our toxic burden and increase cardiovascular risk by causing oxidative stress. So you've heard me say that a few times. That's the chronic inflammation, creating free radicals, which leads to rust and breakdown in a system. So the heavy metals themselves, different ones can be supporting oxidative stress in the heart. They also can support, different ones support systemic inflammation, which ultimately can inflame the heart. They can interfere with absorption and excretion of nutrients that may support cardiovascular health. They may also increase blood pressure, and that's another risk factor for cardiovascular health. They may also cause weight gain. So that's important. Metabolic disturbance in the body that might be supporting cardiovascular risk. So heavy metals, that's a whole talk in and of itself, and different metals have different risks, but that's kind of a nutshell, some things that you can see with cardiovascular risk and heavy metals. So now you may or may not have heard of things called POPs, which are persistent organic pollutants. These are things we talk a lot about in the functional medicine world. These are your environmental toxins that are coming through products, whether it's products you're putting on your skin, things you're eating, drinking, plastic, clothing, etc. And so I put down several of the pops here. They may cause cardiovascular injury and actually increase blood pressure in and of themselves. PCBs in particular induce inflammation. They increase a step in the development of atherosclerosis called by increasing the adhesion molecule 1. They also are found to increase oxidative stress. They impair nitric oxide activity in the endothelial tissue. What this means is nitric oxide is a really important molecule that is used in the vessels. The blood vessels receive a signal with nitric oxide, which causes them to dilate. And that's very important because the dilation of blood vessels, so them getting bigger, that actually relaxes the pressure and the resistance in the cardiovascular system. So we need to have appropriate relaxation endothelial tissue, which is in the vessels. So the POPs, or PCBs in particular, they've been found to actually impair that step so that they don't dilate. There's more vasoconstriction, which means there's more pressure and resistance in the system, which is a risk for the cardiovascular system. And then lastly, they may support apoptosis of the endothelial cells. Remember, those are inside of the blood vessels, the endothelial cells, and apoptosis just means cell death. So these can actually cause these cells, which are very important and vital for cardiovascular health, to actually die. So now let's talk about one more toxin. It's called ADMA. This is one that has been seen with people who eat a poor diet. It's also seen in people with high cholesterol or hyperlipidemia or dyslipidemia, which I've been speaking about, atherosclerosis, which are the changes in the vessels that lead to cardiovascular disease, heart failure, diabetes, chronic kidney failure or disease. ADMA, like what I was just speaking about with the PCBs, may interfere with nitric oxide synthesis. So remember, nitric oxide is a molecule in the vessels respond to by dilating. So vasodilation, getting the vessel itself, the lumen, the tube getting bigger, allowing the system to relax and for the pressure to come down. This is important because when these endothelial vasodilation in the vessels doesn't happen, that in of itself is a risk factor for atherosclerosis, the changes in the vessels that support cardiovascular disease. So this in and of itself is an important and modifiable risk factor for us to be aware of. Now, this last modifiable risk factor, I certainly talk to my clients all the time about clotting disorders. There's not as much that I found would be as helpful to speak about in the context of gut health. However, the more you eat a phytonutrient dense diet, meaning you're eating from the full color spectrum of the wheel, so eating lots of the different colors in plants, particularly vegetables, very helpful because you're going to get a lot of phytonutrients that will have some supporting optimal blood cell health. However, there's not a lot specific to the gut that I'm aware of to speak about there. I wanted to give this one last slide. This whole conversation that we've been having today, the therapeutics and the interventions we would utilize for this, it's a whole conversation of itself. And really each factor that we went through could be a conversation or discussion in of itself. But I wanted to give you just some bullet points to walk away from how you can today start to influence working on gut health and nutrition to support healthy cardiovascular systems. So the first and most important step is to decrease stress. To me, that means have some form of mindfulness, meditation in the morning, in the evening. All my clients who work with me know that I say that almost every visit. It's essential to every single cell in your body. So that is very, very important. The next important step is to reduce the inflammatory burden on the body. You can just start to do this today by decreasing inflammatory foods and inflammatory belly fat. I'm a huge advocate of leaning into things rather than just throwing the whole kitchen sink out or the whole bathtub out with the baby. I'd rather you just start to add every day, add a new phytonutrient dense, fiber rich dense food, plant-based coming into your system. So by adding more phytonutrient, fiber rich foods, you're going to get a lot of phytonutrients that are going to help to decrease inflammation in your system and ultimately decrease that inflammatory belly fat. So just starting to make a few changes at once, and then you'll start to become aware of how you're feeling. And I found that people intuitively over time will start to drop habits are not as supportive of optimal health. So that would be one suggestion that I would make. The next thing that I would leave you with is to make sure you're eating whole foods and a plant-rich diet. I'm not talking about being vegan or vegetarian. That's a personal decision that you have to make for yourself. But I'm saying irrespective of what protein, what the basis of your diet is in terms of protein, that you do get a lot of plant-rich foods in, because they contain, each color that you eat from the different vegetables and fruits has a different phytonutrient that is impacting your health in a favorable way. So the more you're eating that full color spectrum, you're turning on a lot of different supportive nutrients for your system. This in here in particular, I want to be also focusing on eliminating the processed foods that is going to support interrupting with that insulin and blood sugar response, so that you're not always dumping in a deluge of glucose and inflammatory fats into your system, which interfere with optimal blood sugar and insulin regulation, and instead start to replace some of these with some plant-rich foods. And then exercise, because that's very important to be getting our systems moving to help with insulin and blood sugar regulation. I would also encourage you to eat more whole foods that are fiber rich. This step is here to remind you to support a diverse microbiome so that your system is able to support and increase a healthy intestinal barrier, which is important for your immune system, insulin resistance. It's also important for pulling toxins out. So fiber in particular binds toxins. So that's an important thing that you can just do. Just start adding more fiber through eating more plants every day. And then I would work on detoxification. Again, starting at the level of food and decreasing the processed food and eating more whole foods, and then reduce your exposure to toxins through the products that you're eating a lot of processed, prepackaged foods, drinking from plastic, all the different ways in which we allow toxins to come into our life. And the big one that I would also mention here for decreasing the toxic burden is also getting back to that first one I mentioned, decreasing stress, decrease the toxic burden in our mental life, our mental health, so that we actually are able to detox better. So the more stressed we are, remember I said that downregulates our ability to be able to detoxify. So the more that we're listening to and surrounding ourselves with very positive influences and information, we're actually going to support ourselves by calming our nervous systems down. And the way that I tend to explain this to my clients is that when you are over here and a lion's chasing you, and that could just mean for you today, a lion chasing you could be you had a stressful work day and this just becomes your new norm. When that tiger or lion is chasing you, your body is not going to do anything supportive, or at least not optimally, in the rest and restore state, which means it's not going to optimally detoxify, balance blood sugar, make appropriate and supportive choices in terms of what you're eating and drinking. It becomes much more difficult to choose those rest, restore, healing choices through your lifestyle and diet when you've got that proverbial tiger chasing you, which is in modern times work or other, worries that people have. So the more that you can take the time out to let some of that go, spend some time in meditation, spend some time in nature, that really can have a really profound effect on your health. So with that, that's the end of the discussion today. And I just thank you for listening and have a great day and be well.
Welcome to Root the Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.